Your Honors, I would now like to introduce the expert witness, Mr. Brad Simpson. He is a historian of US foreign policy and Indonesian politics who has been researching the topic of Western complicity in the 1965 killings for nearly 20 years. He is the author of Economists with Guns, Authoritarian Development and US-Indonesian Relations, 1960 through 1968. He has taught previously at Princeton University and now at University of Connecticut. He also directs a project at the National Security Archive to declassify secret US government documents on human rights abuses in Indonesia and East Timor during the era of General Suharto. Mr. Simpson, is this correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Can you briefly help us to understand the larger context of US policy towards Indonesia before 1965?
Yes, I can, and thank you for having me before this tribunal. I'm a historian who has been researching and writing about these topics for many years, and I, as a historian, have been very interested in understanding why the United States, among other Western governments, chose to support the Indonesian armed forces in 1965 as it carried out these grave atrocities. The immediate background to 1965 is the Indonesian Civil War of 1957 and 1958, in which the United States and Great Britain helped to provoke a disastrous regional conflict in which the Indonesian armed forces emerged gravely politically damaged, and in which the Indonesian Communist Party emerged as a very prominent nationalist force due to its support for the central government. The United States, which had backed this regional rebellion, realized by 1958 that it had essentially waged a civil war against two anti-communist factions of the same army, and it sought to repair its relations with the Indonesian armed forces by initiating a program of military and economic and technical assistance to try and draw Indonesia closer to the United States. At the end of 1958...
Excuse me, can you slow down a little bit?
At the end of 1958, the Dwight D. Eisenhower administration formulated a policy directive known as NSC 5901, if we could please show the slide, which argued that U.S. military assistance should prioritize, and I quote, programs and projects which offer the opportunity to isolate the PKI, drive it into positions of open opposition to the Indonesian government, thereby creating grounds for the repressive measures politically justifiable in terms of Indonesian national self-interest. And this is the policy that drove the United States in its relations with Indonesia for the next 4 years. During the next 4 years, the United States provided more than $200 million worth of military training to the Indonesian armed forces, including extensive training for both Indonesian police and army personnel. By 1956, the U.S. ambassador to Indonesia reported that, quote, all lines of command in the Army now flow through officers who have been trained in the United States. By 1965, according to the Central Intelligence Agency, 2,800 members of Indonesia's officer corps had received training at U.S. service schools. Moreover, beginning in 1961, the U.S. State Department recommended that traditional military training for Indonesian officers be supplemented with, quote, specialized instruction designed to improve their ability to discharge civil administrative responsibilities, including training in legal affairs, public safety, finance, education, economics, property control, supply management, and public communications. In other words, the United States was beginning to train the Indonesian armed forces to run the Indonesian state and to take over civilian administrative functions from the current government. And so this is the sort of broad background. In 1963 and 1964, we know that Indonesia had launched a program of confrontation with Malaysia, or the British government, over the formation of Malaysia. The United States was also deepening its involvement in Vietnam. There was a deepening economic crisis in Indonesia itself because of Sukarno's mismanagement of the economy, and a perception among US and other Western officials that the Indonesian Communist Party was continuing to grow in strength, while the army and other social forces were reluctant to confront them. And so it was in this context that the United States formulated an expanded program of covert operations in the fall of 1964.
Thank you very much. And so why, in the summer of 1964, did the US and Great Britain decide to expand covert operations in Indonesia? What did these covert operations consist of? And what was their goal? If you could elaborate on this.
In September of 1964, the Central Intelligence Agency sent the US State Department a proposal for, quote, a program of covert action aimed at affecting the current trend of events. If we could show the second slide. Up until this point, the CIA's covert activities in Indonesia have been limited to contacting opposition politicians and movements and engaging in limited harassment of the Communist Party. Now, the agency proposed intensified covert operations aimed at, quote, building up strength among non-communist and anti-communist groups and organizations and encouraging direct action against the PKI as a party. The purpose of this exercise, the memo suggested, was agitation and the instigation of internal strife between communist and non-communist elements. In other words, the CIA was proposing to instigate armed conflict between the army and the PKI through the initiation of covert operations, propaganda, and the like. These operations dovetailed with British covert operations, which had begun in December of 1963 during the military conflict with Indonesia. British goals were somewhat different than those of the United States in that the goals of British covert operations were both to frustrate the PKI as well as to block the Indonesian army from being able to carry out military operations against Malaysia. 8 months before the CIA began its covert operations, the British government initiated a covert program aimed at, quote, stirring up dissension between different factions inside of Indonesia. And these operations were directed from Malaysia and Singapore beginning in late 1963. As the Foreign Ministry put it at the time, the goal of these operations is to create a prolonged struggle for power leading to civil war or anarchy to prevent the waging of confrontation. The United States, at the time, in the fall of 1964, suggested that its program went beyond the framework of existing policy, which was to simply keep track of opposition to Sukarno, and instead would begin seeking Sukarno's overthrow rather than maintaining links with the military in the hopes of outlasting him. The risks the US government thought were substantial, but as the CIA argued, these risks must be taken. The CIA went on to ask, just how far can we go in attempting to split the PKI and to pit the PKI against non-communist elements, particularly the army? Is it unthinkable to foment internal tensions, which under the right circumstances might force the army to assume broad powers in restoring order? And so in October and November of 1964, the CIA and State Department officials met to refine their covert action proposal. They proposed using propaganda to, quote, create an image of the PKI as an increasingly dangerous, ambitious opponent of Sukarno and of legitimate Indonesian nationalism. They plan to accelerate the cleavages between communists and so-called legitimate national forces. Thirdly, the CIA would encourage, coordinate, and where possible, covertly assist individuals and organizations prepared to take obstructive action against the PKI. Over the long term, this meant identifying elements of a possible post-Sukarno leadership. In November of 1964, the presidential administration of Lyndon Johnson approved this covert action plan. And in March of 1965, the State Department and CIA reviewed this plan to analyze its success up to this point. The United States, it was now proposed, would develop black and gray propaganda themes for use within Indonesia and via appropriate media assets outside of the country. This was done again in coordination with the British government, which was operating from its secret intelligence bases inside of Singapore. This is at a time when the United States was actually decreasing military and other forms of economic assistance as Sukarno's anti-colonial and anti-American rhetoric began to heighten. And so we see a dynamic in which the US was reducing military assistance and increasing covert operations to both reduce its public visibility while increasing its covert operations inside Indonesia. This was done, as I mentioned, in coordination with the British government, whose covert operation program involved support for regional separatist movements in Sulawesi, northern Sumatra, and Kalimantan, offensive military action against Indonesian forces in Borneo, and psychological warfare activities directed from Singapore and Malaysia. In February of 1965, the British set up the Information Research Department of the Foreign Office, which specialized in unattributable propaganda, and set up an office in Singapore to carry out propaganda aimed at an Indonesian audience. In July of 1965, the Foreign Office decided to step up these operations by appointing a coordinator of political warfare in Singapore. The name, the intelligence specialist who would take over this office was named Norman Reddaway, and he was scheduled to take his post in October of 1965. At this time, both American and British officials made it clear that the goal of these covert operations was to try and provoke an armed clash between the army and the Communist Party in the expectation that the army would emerge victorious over the largely unarmed and defenseless PKI. Many Western officials suggested at the time that they hoped to encourage the PKI to wage an unsuccessful bid for power, which would justify the army taking repressive countermeasures in response. As Edward Peck, the Assistant Secretary of State in the Foreign Office of Great Britain, suggested to other regional ambassadors in March of 1965, and I quote, "There might be much to be said for encouraging a premature PKI coup during Sukarno's lifetime, provided the coup failed." And this was the situation on the eve of October 1st, 1965.
Thank you very much. So, how did the US and other Western countries and powers react to the September 30th movement? In what way were they complicit with the killings which began to unfold in early October? And if you could elaborate as well, in what specific ways did they intervene in support of the army?
They intervened in three ways. I would first say that we should ask what the US and other Western governments knew about what was about to happen. To what degree did they encourage the army in its efforts, and what material assistance did they provide to these ends? When the September 30th movement first happened, The US and other Western governments were initially unsure as to the responsible parties, but American officials quickly centered on the PKI as the party they deemed most likely responsible. Even though American officials, I think, correctly estimated that several of the top leaders of the PKI were involved in the September 30th movement, they recognized at the time that the broad membership of the party was completely innocent of any involvement, and that if anyone from the Communist Party was involved, it was only a tiny element of the party leadership. Nevertheless, the CIA reported on October 4th, regardless of whether the Army really believes the PKI was solely responsible, it is presenting this as the case and is acting accordingly. Immediately after September 30th, the Lyndon Johnson administration organized an ad hoc Indonesia working group, recognizing that a major opportunity to crush the Communist Party was at hand, but that the Army might not be willing to go all the way. As one Johnson administration official put it to a visiting journalist, and I quote, "This is a critical time for the Army. If the Army does move, they have the strength to wipe up the earth with the PKI, and if they don't, they may not have another chance." US embassy officials established back-channel covert contacts with General Nasution through his chief assistant, General Nasution being one of the generals who survived the September 30th movement, and thereafter they maintained nearly daily contact with him, relaying requests for assistance and discussing the situation with Nasution and other Indonesian officials. It's important to note that no Western intelligence agencies argued that PKI involvement in the September 30th movement extended to the rank and file. As a historian, I have therefore concluded that the greatest fear of the US and other Western governments was that the Army might refrain from mass violence against the party's unarmed members and supporters, who by all accounts were unaware of and uninvolved in the movement. In mid-October, as the killings were getting underway, by this point the United States had already heard of many thousands of people being killed in northern Sumatra. On October 13th, the US Secretary of State Dean Rusk cabled the US Embassy that, quote, "The time has come to give some indication to the military of our attitude towards recent and current developments. The Army's campaign against the Communist Party was picking up momentum," and, quote, "If the Army's willingness to follow through against the PKI is in any way contingent upon or subject to influence by the US, we do not wish to miss the opportunity for US action." The CIA warned in early October of the danger that the Army might only, quote, "settle for action against those directly involved in the murders of the generals and permit Sukarno to get much of his power back." The Army's destruction of the PKI, the US ambassador cabled to Washington in mid-October, and I quote, "will not be successful unless it is willing to attack communism as such," attacking the party and its rank-and-file supporters. The US ambassador observed, again this is in mid-October, and I quote, "The Army has nevertheless been working hard at destroying the PKI, and I, for one, have increasing respect for the determination and organization in carrying out this crucial assignment." During this time, the US and Britain carried out several policies in support of these killings. Perhaps the most important initial signal was sent by the government of Great Britain, which signaled to Indonesian army commanders that they would refrain from attacking it while it sought to destroy the PKI. We must remember that Britain was involved in a low-level war with Indonesia at the time, and Indonesian military commanders were reluctant to divert their forces to attacking Communist Party members in places like northern Sumatra and central Java, while they were otherwise under threat from British officials or British armed forces. On October 8th, General Nasution approached American officials seeking to get guarantees from British officials that they would not attack Indonesia during this period. And fears of a British Malayan attack on Sumatra initially prompted Suharto to deny Indonesian General Kemal Idris permission to send troops from Jakarta to Medan to initiate the mass killings, which began soon after he received those needed assurances. When the US ambassador conveyed British assurances to General Nasution, 3 days afterwards, RPK-AD forces began their attacks in central Java. At the end of October, White House officials began established an interagency working group to begin planning for the provision of covert assistance to the Indonesian military to meet its needs in attacking the PKI. The Indonesia Working Group sent a request to the US Embassy to inventory the Army's needs for waging war against its own population. The most pressing need was for tactical communications equipment for both the Army headquarters in Jakarta as well as for field units. Many of the existing communications technology was controlled by radio and communications workers, which were affiliated with Communist Party unions, and the Army sought secure means of communication with which it could quickly relay information to its officers in the field, as well as within Jakarta. In early November, Indonesian General Sukendro, who had been trained in the US and had very close contacts with the Central Intelligence Agency, made the first high-level approach to the US Embassy, requesting rice, communications equipment, medicine, and small weapons and ammunition. The US Ambassador Marshall Green recommended that the Johnson administration approve this assistance, noting that, quote, the Army is moving relentlessly to exterminate the PKI. The 303 Committee, which was the interdepartmental committee coordinating U.S. covert operations, also agreed on November 19 to give the Army a secure communications system to maintain contact with each other and with elements of the U.S. armed forces. CIA technicians traveled to Indonesia to help install this equipment. The U.S. very conveniently tuned the equipment to signals that could be easily listened to by American officials, as well as Australian and British officials who had cracked the Indonesian ciphers and codes and could therefore monitor Indonesian Army communications on a daily basis. In early November, the White House also authorized the CIA station in Bangkok, Thailand, to begin providing small arms to General Sukendro in order to, quote, arm Muslim and nationalist youth in Central Java for use against the PKI. At the same time, the CIA authorized the covert payment of 50 million rupiah to finance the activities of the anti-communist group Kap Gestapu. The U.S. Ambassador Marshall Green noted approvingly that Kap Gestapu's activities have, quote, been an important factor in the Army program, especially in Central Java, where a campaign of mass murder was then underway. The ambassador considered the risks of revelation, in this case, to be as minimal as any black bag operation can be. Finally, among other forms of assistance, the CIA and the U.S. Embassy passed along the names of nearly 7,000 PKI leaders and officers and members of affiliated organizations. The U.S. Embassy told the State Department in early 1966 that Indonesian authorities, quote, seem to lack even the simplest information on PKI leadership. And so the U.S. State Department and CIA officials turned over the lists that they had compiled over the previous several years to Indonesian Army officials who used those lists to create detailed profiles of the PKI in parts of the country where Army intelligence was lacking. U.S. officials passed these lists to aides to Adam Malik, who in turn passed them on to General Suharto, who used them to track down PKI members for arrest and execution. Ironically, Army leaders were worried by the tone of American and British propaganda and covert assistance at this time. In private communications, Army officials urged the embassy, quote, not to unduly emphasize that it is seeking revenge against the PKI. It argued that the military, quote, has its hands full restoring order and stability without creating the impression that it is going to massacre communists. Nevertheless, this was the stated goal of US propaganda efforts early in October and November of 1965. The US ambassador, or the UK ambassador, Andrew Gilchrist, called for, quote, early and careful propaganda and psy-war activities to exacerbate internal strife and ensure the destruction and putting to flight of the PKI by the Indonesian army. US Ambassador Marshall Green noted that the US should, quote, spread the story of the PKI's guilt, treachery, and brutality, arguing that this was perhaps the most needed immediate assistance we can give to the Army if we can find a way to do it without identifying it as solely or largely a US effort. British and American intelligence forces unfolded a very sophisticated propaganda operation over the latter half of October and through November and December, operating from the British Psychological Warfare Office in Singapore. US and British officials would produce unattributable propaganda that they would hand out to Western journalists, which were printed in most Western newspapers and sent back into Indonesia, thereby amplifying the Army's own propaganda. Other press materials were doctored to make them appear as if they had originated in other countries, such as the Philippines or Pakistan. The Voice of America and other radio stations broadcast the Army's propaganda claims as truth, and the British intelligence services set up a black transmitter to broadcast what it called Radio Free Indonesia programs from Malaysia and Singapore into Indonesia itself, making it appear that Indonesians were reporting on the brutality of the PKI. This also included the Australian government, which gave daily guidance after October 1st to Radio Australia to highlight reports discrediting the PKI and showing its involvement in the September 30th movement. The Australian media seemed to have faithfully followed these guidelines, for, as Keith Shan, the Australian ambassador to Jakarta, later reported, the Australian government and the Indonesian armed forces were generally pleased with the results of their propaganda operations. I'd like to note during this time that the United States was very aware of the extent of the killings that were then underway. The CIA argued in late November, nearly a month after it had begun receiving reports of mass killings, and I quote, "We should avoid being too cynical about the Army's motives and its self-interest, or too hesitant about the propriety of extending assistance, provided that we can do so covertly and without being embarrassed." Now, during this time, reports were coming in to the US Embassy, to the US Consulate in Medan, to the Australian Embassy, to the British Embassy, and to other Western embassies about the extent and scale of the killings. Now, as a historian, it is important to not simply read these descriptions and lose sight of the fact that they are coming out in the midst of lots of other political reporting. Any of you who have worked in an embassy or a government bureaucracy know that they produce lots and lots of paper, and we should have some perspective on just how much was being reported at the time. Nevertheless, dozens and dozens of reports emerged in October, November, December of 1965, making it very, very clear to all Western governments that the Indonesian army was embarked on a campaign of extermination against its unarmed civilian opponents. The U.S. administration's decisions to extend aid to Indonesia were taken place after it had become perfectly clear that the U.S. would be directly assisting the army and other anti-communist forces in a campaign of mass murder against unarmed civilians, and that its covert assistance would directly aid in these efforts. In early October, Army contacts with General Nasution informed the embassy that 150 members of the PKI had been executed in Jakarta alone by October 7th by West Java military commander General Aji. Similar reports emerged of the mass murders then underway in Medan and Aceh. By late October, reports were reaching the embassy of mass attacks against supporters of the PKI in East, West, and Central Java. A U.S. military advisor who had returned from Bandung, about 2 hours from Jakarta, reported that villagers were, and I quote, clearing out PKI members and affiliates and turning them over to the army for arrest or execution. A few weeks later, the U.S. Embassy cabled the State Department that RPK-ED forces in Central Java under Sarwo Edi's command were, quote, providing Muslim youth with training and arms and will keep them out in front against the PKI. While the army was arresting PKI leaders for interrogation, the embassy reported smaller fry are being systematically arrested and jailed or executed. In North Sumatra and Aceh, a few days later, the U.S. Embassy received a report stating that, quote, youth organizations and anti-communist elements are engaged in a systematic drive to destroy the PKI, with wholesale killings reported. The specific message from the army is that it is seeking to, quote, finish off the PKI. On November 13th, Police Information Chief Colonel Budi Juwono reported, and I quote, from 50 to 100 PKI members are being killed every night in East and Central Java by civilian anti-communist groups with the blessings of the army. 3 days later, Pemuda Pancasila members, described by the U.S. Embassy as bloodthirsty, informed the consulate in Medan that they intended to kill every PKI member that they can get their hands on. This goes on and on for many weeks. On November 14th, an American missionary told the U.S. Embassy of the massacre of 3,400 PKI activists by Ansor youth militia leaders at Kediri in East Java. U.S. consular officials in Medan concluded that, quote, even accounting for exaggerations, a reign of terror is taking place in Central and East Java. Later in November, the CIA reported that former PKI members in Central Java were being shot on sight by the army. Missionaries in East Java told the consulate in Surabaya in late November that 15,000 alleged PKI members had been killed in the East Javanese city of Tulungagung alone. Even discounted for exaggerations, the consulate reported a systematic and widespread slaughter was taking place. In early December, this is before the mass murders began in Bali, where more than 80,000 people were killed. In early December, General Ahmad, the newly appointed chief of Coty's economic staff, told the U.S. military attaché Willis Ethel that he estimated that over 100,000 people have been killed in North Sumatra and East and Central Java alone. If true, this would mean, as he put it, that more Indonesian communists have been killed than have been killed in Vietnam. The Australian ambassador to Jakarta, Ambassador Shan, wrote on December 19th that, quote, in many cases the massacres of entire families have taken place because one member spoke to the communists. Some of the methods adopted are unspeakable. It has been a bloodbath of savage intensity, remarkably unpublicized, and locally regarded with a ghoulish cynicism. These massacres took place at facilities operated by American and British businessmen, such as the Goodyear rubber plantation. In January of 1966, an American working at the Goodyear rubber plantation in northern Sumatra reported that 290 people, mainly members of the PKI-affiliated rubber plantation workers, had been killed on his plantation alone. In February of 1966, the US consulate reported that in northern Sumatra, the Army is, quote, arresting, converting, or otherwise disposing of some 3,000 PKI members a week. By the spring of 1966, US and other Western officials had estimated that upwards of 300,000 unarmed civilians had been slaughtered. The Swedish ambassador, who traveled around East and Central Java by motorcycle during December and January, reported that US and British estimates of only 400,000 people killed were far too low. The US or the UK ambassador to the United Kingdom asked Norman Redaway, the information warfare specialist in Singapore, quote, "What have we to hope from the Indonesian generals? 400,000 people murdered, far more than the total casualties in Vietnam, and nobody cares. They were communists, weren't they? And are communists not human beings?" A few months later, the US political consul in Jakarta, Edward Masters, met with aides to Adam Malik, who reported to him that they thought figures of 400,000 civilians killed were far too low. Nevertheless, Edward Masters talked to them about, quote, the desirability of downplaying the extent of the carnage, remarking that we believe it is wiser to err on the side of lower estimates, especially when questioned by the media. So we know that the US was engaging in a campaign of covert operations precisely at the moment when the Army was waging this campaign of extermination against the PKI. The question was, what did the US and other governments hope to achieve from these activities? And I think here the question needs to be, or the answer needs to be phrased slightly carefully. In early December, US, British, and other Western officials met at quadripartite talks in London, where they began to plan on the possible resumption of Western assistance to Indonesia. This is at the moment when the killings are at their peak, and when Western assistance to the Indonesian army is at its height. The available evidence suggests that the US and Britain had sought to encourage the PKI into a coup attempt in the hopes of provoking a violent attack by the army, and that its support for the mass killing of PKI supporters was the direct consequence of the covert assistance that it and the British government extended to the army. At the quadripartite talks in London in December of 1965, the US Secretary of State Dean Rusk stated to his colleagues that, quote, "The US and other countries need to begin letting the army know what the US expects in return for assistance." Now, it's important to note that we as historians can read this cable traffic and believe that the United States and other Western governments were merely passive observers, that they had no ability to stop the killings, that the killings had their own domestic logic, and that the United States was simply cheering on these killings from the sideline and could not have stopped them if it chose to do so. I believe that the evidentiary record suggests quite the opposite. We know that when the United States did perceive its interests to be threatened, that it could intervene quite decisively. In my own writing, I have discovered that in October and November of 1965, the Indonesian government, after the September 30th movement, actually began moving ahead with plans to nationalize the oil refining capacity of Western oil companies then in Indonesia. So they were moving ahead with plans to take over the refineries of US and British companies that had been initially proposed by Sukarno in the spring of 1965. US and British officials began sending alarmed warnings to their Indonesian counterparts, warning them that if the army went ahead with the nationalization of refining facilities, that they would cut off all forms of assistance to them. This was in November of 1965. The US Embassy at the time put it this way: the Indonesian army is strongly nationalist, and finishing off the PKI will not change this. The problem, as the US Embassy put it, is that even the most anti-communist army leadership is strongly imbued with the conviction that Indonesians must control their own natural resources and have control over their own affairs. The US Embassy evidently thought differently, and it warned the Indonesian army in grave terms of the consequences of continuing with the nationalization of refining capacity. And so on December 16th, General Suharto himself told his Indonesian army colleagues that attacks against US and British oil facilities were to cease, and indeed they did so. After the massacres were finished and the Suharto regime began to consolidate its power, we can see more of the ways in which the US and other Western powers began to achieve some of their longer-range goals. Indonesia passed a very liberal foreign investment law in 1967, which was partially drafted by the US Embassy in Jakarta. US and other Western companies were invited back to Indonesia on very generous terms beginning in 1966. The US, the foreign investment law, which was drafted with the advice and guidance of the United States, systematically went through the various sectors of the Indonesian economy and outlined to the Indonesian government which sectors they insisted needed to be open to Western investors. The Indonesian ministry officials who were drafting the foreign investment law actually requested advice from Western and American companies on what they thought the foreign investment law should look like, and tailored the law to meet American and Western desires, while at the same time attempting to ensure that the law would be seen as in keeping with Indonesian sovereignty. For these efforts, the US and other Western governments helped to establish the Intergovernmental Group on Indonesia, a consortium of donor countries which began to extend economic credits, to reschedule loan payments, and to provide a variety of economic and technical assistance beginning in late 1966 and 1967. It is my cautious conclusion that the United States and other Western governments during this period were in an historically unique position to influence the terms and the conditions under which the Suharto regime consolidated its power, having provided a relatively small but politically crucial margin of support to the regime at its moment of greatest need and vulnerability. The US and other Western countries were in a position to then take advantage of the goodwill generated by its support for the army in wiping out the PKI, and received very tangible benefits in 1966 and 1967. I further believe that without this support, it is very likely that the Army would have been hampered substantially in its efforts to carry out these killings. Had the British government not given its blessing and refrained from attacking Indonesian army forces during this time, had the United States not provided small arms and other forms of material assistance, had the United States not supported the Army's request in December of 1966 to begin diverting the royalties from oil and natural gas production away from the Indonesian government into secret Swiss bank accounts that the Army could use for its own personal use, a decision which was authorized by the US Embassy in December of 1965. Without these actions, I argue, it is very likely that the Indonesian Army would have faced much greater obstacles in carrying out these killings than it otherwise did.
Thank you very much, Mr. Simpson. This shows very clearly, and you could back your statement with documents, the support which was given by foreign states, which was not only a small support that continued knowledge of the events and killings, but was significant. Let me, however, to explore a little bit the level of control that the foreign states and the US had, ask you a question which is, I hope, not cynical after we have heard the extent of support and interests of these states. But if the US and other Western countries had opposed the killings, do you think they had leverage to intervene to stop or contain them? Or do you think events were largely beyond their control? Or explore a little bit on the level of control they really had, only if they would have the interest to oppose the killings?
And here we can only speculate.
Of course, yeah.
I think that the evidence that I, as a historian, have encountered suggests that the United States and Great Britain had substantial leverage, and that the Suharto regime, or the Indonesian army, was very vulnerable at the time. Vulnerable both militarily to attack from British forces, and vulnerable politically and economically. Had the British government, for its part, declined to stop attacking Indonesian military forces in Kalimantan and Malaysia, the Indonesian army would not have been able to carry out many of these killings. In fact, a British naval vessel under Panamanian flag actually accompanied Sarwo Edi and Colonel Aji in transporting Indonesian troops from Sumatra to East Java in late October 1965. They literally helped them to get to the place where the killings were about to begin. And there are many other ways in which the US and Britain directly aided in the killings. By January of 1966, Indonesian military officials were reporting that they were running out of ammunition for their small weapons, that the killings had already proceeded to such an extent that they literally did not have enough bullets to shoot people anymore. I've seen documents suggesting that the Swedish government helped to arrange, perhaps through intermediaries, for the purchase of up to $10 million in small arms and ammunition, which were provided covertly. There's a lot of uncertainty swirling around as to who is providing what and through what channels. We do know that some of the weapons being provided by the CIA were of Soviet and Eastern European origin, so as to mask their provenance, and so that it would not be clear that the US was providing these weapons. But we do know that they were providing weapons and very likely ammunition as well. I think we can speculate that this is almost certainly the case through the CIA station in Bangkok and through British channels that had already been established in northern Sumatra, and that these weapons were crucial for the army in places where it was directly arming Muslim and student groups to execute PKI members. Moreover, the Indonesian army was economically very vulnerable, and here I believe that the support provided by the United States was actually crucially important. The United States began providing supplies, things like uniforms and shoes, cotton, rice, to the Indonesian army in late 1965 and 1966. And the army and its affiliates began distributing these supplies in places where they were carrying out the massacres as well, so as to suggest to the Indonesian population that the Sukarno administration could no longer provide for the needs of the Indonesian population and that the army was increasingly in control. The US decision, and I think that this is a crucial decision, to allow the army, or let me back up, the Indonesian army approached Western companies, Caltex, Stanvac, these are British and US oil companies, as well as Goodyear Rubber and other Western companies, and asked them to begin diverting their foreign exchange reserves, diverting their royalties that they would normally pay to the Indonesian government. They requested that the Western companies begin diverting these funds into secret bank accounts controlled by the army, which were to be located in Geneva, in Switzerland. And the US Embassy authorized the Indonesian army to make this request and authorized the Western companies to accede to that request. That request led to the defunding of the Indonesian government, or the withholding of the government's largest and virtually sole supply of foreign currency and foreign reserves, without which it was unable to purchase any imports in late 1965 and early 1966. And this withholding of foreign exchange helped to lead to the near total collapse of the Indonesian economy in the early months of 1966. And it is in the midst of this profound economic chaos that the army was able to help mobilize tens of thousands of students and other Indonesian opponents of the PKI in cities like Jakarta, Bandung, and elsewhere to protest against Sukarno and the party, arguing that Sukarno and the PKI had created chaos and that the party should be destroyed and Sukarno should be ousted. Much of this chaos was in fact produced by the army itself, and much of the economic collapse was not a significant part of this economic collapse, I would say, was not merely the result of the ongoing economic turmoil, but was the direct result of actions taken by the army with the direct support and full knowledge of the US and other Western governments.
Thank you very much. I have a last question on the material from what you took your or made your analysis. Can you tell us where you got the cables and information that you presented to us, and also what is still not yet disclosed?
All of the evidence that I have cited here today is publicly available. I located much of this evidence in researching my first book in the US National Archives, at the Lyndon Johnson Presidential Library, at the United Kingdom National Archives, and at the Australian National Archives. All of these documents have been declassified. Some of them have already been published in edited form by the State Department, for example. What we are still lacking access to are the signals intelligence, meaning the raw intelligence which was being monitored by US and British and Australian military officials in the fall of 1965 and 1966 because we know that they were monitoring Indonesian military communications. We also lack access to much of the reporting by the U.S. military attaché in Indonesia, who was in daily communications with General Nasution. And most importantly, we lack access to what are called the job files of the Central Intelligence Agency, meaning the records of its covert operations during the period from September of 1964 to March of 1966. We do have much of the intelligence reporting from this period. The CIA produced lots of intelligence as well as engaging in covert operations. And recently, the Central Intelligence Agency declassified the entirety of its presidential daily briefings for the period from 1960 to 1968. And so we can read the record of what the president at the time, Lyndon Johnson, was reading from the Central Intelligence Agency about what was happening in Indonesia. Those daily briefings are not nearly as graphic as the materials that I have described to you, but in other memoranda and communications with the U.S. President, his national security advisor, Walt Rostow, for example, described to him in early 1966 that the U.S. policy in response to the massacres was silence, which is a good thing in light of the slaughter that took place there. Meaning that the official U.S. policy in response to the mass killings was to say nothing, and that this was a good thing in light of how many people have been killed with the knowledge of the U.S. in Indonesia. There remains much that ought to be declassified, but I think the record that we now have shows quite conclusively that the U.S. and other Western governments both knew what was happening, that they had engaged in covert operations for more than a year to try and encourage the army to do what it did, and that they provided every form of assistance which they could provide given the level of political risk involved to support the army as it carried out these massacres, knowing full well that the support that they were providing was enabling the army to carry out a campaign of mass murder against unarmed civilians.
Yeah, thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Simpson.